I bought the farm in late summer, because that's when the bank finally gave me the call, and because my last job ended with a box of my things on the hood of a car that wasn't mine. I had just turned 32, and I'd spent the last 8 years selling things on the phone to people who didn't need them. When the company folded, there wasn't much worth keeping, but I took the headset out of habit. It sat in the passenger seat while I drove west from the city and unspooled my life across lanes of asphalt. I didn't have a plan beyond getting to the place and seeing if I could live there. My uncle left me the property. We weren't close. He was the kind of relative you meet at funerals, standing near the cold cuts with a styrofoam cup in his hand. He'd nod when he saw me, like he knew what to say but was too tired to start. People said he'd been a good farmer, a stubborn farmer, which I understood to mean he made just enough to keep things going, and not enough to be anyone's example. He died the winter before, and the lawyer said his will had my name because I'd once fixed his old truck when I was 17, and because he never married. The farm was a long rectangle of land that cut out from the road and ran into a low ridge to the north. A 2-story house, white paint worn to gray along the porch, a barn with a lean in its back like a man with bad knees, sheds that had lost their doors and kept their smells. The fields had been corn stalks at some point, then weeds, then a mix of both. A windbreak of elms and tired pines marked the edge where the land rose, and beyond that the ridge sat like a shoulder against the sky. When clouds pulled low, the ridge made them look heavy. There was a scarecrow in the south field. The first time I saw it, I thought it was fine, even charming. An old coat, a hat with a missing brim, a crossbar like a tired crucifix. It faced the house the way a guard might stand before a gate. I nodded to it without thinking. Later, when I took down the for sale sign that had never found a buyer, I looked up and saw a crow sitting on the scarecrow's shoulder, comfortable like they were old friends. The house smelled like dust and mouse droppings. The kitchen had a calendar stuck on a month from 3 years ago. There was a magnet with a pizza place number that probably didn't deliver out here, and a magnet with a cow shaped like a cow. Cupboards held a few plates, a mug with a chipped lip, a jar of nails, a jar of screws, a jar of rubber bands that had melted into each other. I brought in my things, 2 duffel bags, a box with pans and a coffee maker, the headset I didn't want to admit I had kept, and set them on the counter. The sink ran rusty for a few seconds, then cleared. When I opened the fridge, there was a jar of pickles that had grown a beard. I slept that first night on a couch in the front room. The couch had a sag where a bigger man had sat for years. I woke to the sound of wind pulling across the fields and a noise like a screen door slapping. I lay there and listened to my own breath. There are parts of the city that are never quiet, and you get used to a kind of sleep that floats on top of noise. Here the silence felt like a weight. I kept hearing the house adjusting itself, wood easing, pipes answering small pressures. A raccoon climbed the side of the porch and rattled something loose. Once, something thumped against the back door, and then again, then nothing. I told myself it was the wind. It was always the wind. In the morning I walked the fields. I stepped along the old rows and counted posts in the fallen fence. I found a set of metal teeth buried in grass, the remains of a harrow. I found a pile of empty feed sacks that had been used to cover an engine and then abandoned. The ground near the barn was damp and green, like it remembered a time when animals had stood there. I pulled open the barn doors. Inside, hay bales had slumped into each other and sprouted a thin white mold. A tractor sat under a blue tarp like something under a shroud, its tires flat, its steering wheel cold under a skin of dust. There were nail holes where tools had hung, outlines of wrenches and saws drawn in brown. On the back wall of the barn, someone had written in pencil, in tall, careful letters, "Turn off the pump." I ran my fingers over the words and left a clean streak. I went looking for the pump and found it behind the barn, a small electric unit under a metal hood, hardwired and older than I was. I flipped the switch. Nothing. I flipped it back and left it be. The wellhead sat close by, capped in a way that made me think of a bandage. In the house there was a folder with papers, deeds and tax notices, and 2 letters with county letterhead that talked about a grant my uncle had applied for and then withdrawn. There was a note in his hand on the back of a gas bill. It said simply, "Keep fence closed." The handwriting was blocky but neat. A man who had learned to write against a desk that wasn't his. The next day I drove into town. There's always a town, not big. A handful of streets arranged around a brick building that used to be a train depot, and now was a museum with odd hours. There was a diner where the coffee tasted like the pot had been frightened. There was a hardware store that looked from the outside like a place where you could buy nails and twine, and from the inside like you could buy a sense of belonging if you knew who to ask. The sign said Hassett's. The bell over the door sounded like a real bell. A man behind the counter looked up at me and knew at once who I was. That's the thing about new people in a small place. They're not new in the way you think. Someone mentions you. Someone else remembers. And by the time you arrive, you're already halfway known. "You're Troy's nephew," he said. "The kid with the truck." I nodded. It's been a while since I was a kid. "I'm Hal." He offered his hand. His palm was tough as a boot. "You going to work that land?" "I don't know yet," I said. "I don't know much about it." "You'll learn or you won't." He said this without judgment, as if there were only the 2 outcomes and either one was fine. "Need anything?" I looked around and made a show of considering. I picked up gloves. I picked up fence staples. I picked up a post driver and pretended I would know how to use it. Hal's eyes followed me. He had a way of being present without being in the way. When I paid, he said, "Your uncle kept to himself. Good neighbor, though. He didn't borrow things. You know what I mean?" "I think so," I said. He added a small box of Rugelach to the bag without ringing it up. "From my wife," he said, "for the new owner." "Thanks," I said. "I appreciate that." "People say your uncle had a hard spell at the end," Hal went on. He looked at my hand and said, "You hurt your knuckles?" I looked down. The skin had split where I'd hit it against a piece of rusted tin. I hadn't felt it at the moment. "Fence," I said. "It fights back." He nodded. "There was a boy years ago, teenager. Cut his hand on rust and didn't tell his folks. Got a fever and almost lost him. It's the little cuts that take you, not the ones you see coming. I told him I'd be careful." I drove back with my bags and thought about how my uncle had been a person in other people's sentences. The days settled into a set of motions that didn't seem productive at first. I cleaned. I swept hay out of corners and shoveled what might once have been something alive from the shadows of the shed. I put a lock on the chicken coop door, though there were no chickens. I patched the roof over the porch with tar and wood from a pallet. I learned the sound the wind made when it shoved against the barn from the east, and the different sound it made when it came from the north, and pushed along the ridge, and fell onto the roof in a spill. At night I read the folder with the papers and my uncle's notes. He had kept lists, seed types, weather, small things like found a cat with a date next to it and then cat gone. He'd drawn a diagram of the well with arrows that didn't point to anything obvious. He'd written a set of names: Elder, Pike, Marla. Beside Marla, he had put a question mark. I told myself I didn't need to know who they were. The scarecrow in the south field changed hats. I swear this is true. One morning, walking the fence, I looked up and saw it had a different hat, wider, with a stiff brim that curled like a wave. The old hat had been soft and torn. This one looked like leather. I told myself the wind could have swapped it for the one the crows stole, or that I hadn't looked closely the first time, though I'd noticed enough to remember the missing brim. I walked over to it and stood face to face. The coat was buttoned with twine. The sleeves hung like arms without hands. The smell was a dry smell, like wheat smashing underfoot. The hat looked the way old leather looks when it's been wet and dried and wet again. A strand of barbed wire was twisted around the scarecrow's right wrist. It had been there a while. The post it stood on was solid. I put my hand on the coat and pushed. The body under it, if there was a body, didn't give. My uncle had built it well, I thought. I told myself that, and I went back along the fence. That night I woke again to the sound of the back door moving in its frame. I went down with a flashlight. The beam showed dust. It showed a dark beetle on the threshold and the curled wings of moths. The door was latched. The sound continued. It wasn't the door. It was something moving under the house, along the crawl space. A slow scraping, like someone dragging a piece of wood. I stood there with the light in my hand and felt the house as a thing that sat on the earth and pressed down. The noise stopped. I waited. When it didn't start again, I went outside and walked the foundation. The beam found a vent that had been knocked loose from its frame. There were raccoon prints in the dust. I fixed the vent in the morning with nails, and then I fixed it again that afternoon, because in daylight, I saw the nails had split the wood. On the third week, I drove to the county office to ask about property lines. A woman behind the glass asked for my parcel number and told me where the markers should be. She wore a sweater even though it was warm. There was a complaint last year, she said, looking at her screen, about burning. Your uncle responded. Burning what? I asked. It doesn't say, she said. He said he was burning trash. I thought of the fire pit out back, the ring of stones with ash inside it, and the way ash gets into everything. I signed the papers and left with a map. On my way out, a man in a cowboy hat I had seen earlier in the lobby stopped me and asked if I was Troy's boy. I said nephew. He said, I'm Pike. I remembered the name from my uncle's list and felt a small shock that was probably only the way memory can surprise you. Pike's face was the color of a boiled ham. His eyes were pale and watery and didn't seem to know where to look. You staying out there? He asked. For now, I said. Take care, he said. Don't leave your water out. I didn't understand that, and he didn't explain it. He walked away with a limp that made him choose the side of the hallway where the light was weaker. Back at the farm, I took the map and went looking for markers. The far boundary ran into the ridge and then along it, which put the north fence on an angle that made mowing there a chore my uncle had done with patience I didn't have yet. I found a metal stake in the dirt near a dead oak. I found another near a pile of rocks that had been stacked into a low wall by hands I couldn't imagine. The sun went behind a cloud and the temperature fell in a way that didn't match the time of day. The ridge held the shade and gave it back to me, as if teaching me something about how days could turn quickly. There was a small stand of corn past the north fence, not mine, planted by the neighbor who owned the land beyond. The stalks were tall, tassels pale, ears heavy. The wind moved through them in a way that made you think of 1,000 things whispering at once. I was leaning on my side of the fence looking when I saw the scarecrow. Not mine, the neighbor's. It stood 3 rows in, a dark figure with a post for a spine. I saw it only because the wind turned all the leaves in one direction and then in another, opening a window. I thought about how we put false men into our fields to trick real birds. Then I thought about how we do this, even though the birds learn quickly. I didn't know my neighbor's name. I never met him. I only saw him once, far down the dirt road, stopping his truck to get a mail bundle out of a box and then driving on. That night it rained. The sound on the roof was loud, then soft, then loud again, as if the storm had a breath. I stood on the porch and watched the water pour off the eaves and collect in the rut where a gutter should be. Lightning hit somewhere on the ridge. The sound of it came a moment later, a flat crack that you could feel in your molars. The scarecrow in my field leaned forward and then back as the wind took it. It didn't fall. I told myself that meant the post was strong. The power went out. I lit a candle from a box under the sink. I sat at the table and ate bread and peanut butter and listened to the rain. When the wind shoved the front of the house, the flame leaned. I remembered my uncle's note. Keep fence closed. I had closed it. The gate by the road was heavy, and the latch was stiff, and I had closed it. I told myself that, and put the candle out, and went to the couch. What woke me was not the rain or the wind. It was the sound of rope strained beyond what it was meant to carry. It was a high song without music. I know that sounds wrong, but I can't think of a better way to say it. It came from the fields. The sound was steady, with small jerks in it. I stood at the window and tried to see. The lightning lit the south field briefly. The scarecrow had bent low, almost horizontal, and when the wind eased, it sprang up. It might have been funny to watch if I hadn't lived alone. I tried to go back to sleep. After an hour, the rain turned to a steady fall. No wind, as if the storm had decided on how it wanted to end. I thought I heard something at the back of the house again, but I told myself it was water moving through the gutters I didn't have. I slept and dreamt of ropes. The storm moved out before morning. The power returned. I made coffee and drank it standing. The world had that wet quiet it gets after hard rain, like all the sound went into the ground and would need time to rise back out. I put on boots and went to check the fence. My uncle would have done that, so I did, expecting to find a post down. The fence held. The gate had mud around it like a new footprint. The scarecrow, mine, listed a bit. The post leaned. I went out with the post driver. The ground was soft, I pushed the post back upright without tools and tamped the dirt with my heel. A sleeve hung twisted around the barbed wire, and I thought I'd straighten it. I reached out and took hold of the coat. It was wet leather, not cloth. I don't know why I'd thought it a coat before. Maybe because the shape said coat and I hadn't touched it. It was a leather jacket, the kind you wear on a motorcycle. Old and cracked, but still leather. My uncle didn't ride. I didn't ride. I pulled the sleeve and it didn't move. The barbed wire had bitten deep. There was a smell, not the sweet rot of wet hay, a sour animal smell. Under that, something metallic. I bent closer without meaning to, and saw where the leather had split along the seam under the arm. Inside, not straw, not rags, something pale. I told myself it was the post, but the post was cedar, and this was not that. My stomach moved in a way that went back to childhood, before you learn to tell yourself stories to hold yourself together. I stood, walked back to the house without running, got a pair of tin snips and a box cutter. I went back and stood in front of the scarecrow. I told myself this: it's not what you think. You're jumping. You're letting the storm get into your head. I cut the twine that held the front closed. It had been wrapped around the buttons and then knotted in a way that made me think of hands shaking. The jacket fell open. It was a person. There's no way to say that makes it better. If you don't know what that looks like, your mind supplies a clean picture, something you could sketch in your head. It isn't like that. The body had been in the weather, and then in the sun, in the cold, in the bugs, in the hands of whatever comes at night to pick small pieces and carry them somewhere else. The face was a mask of dark skin pulled tight against bone, the mouth open in a way that said nothing. The eyes were gone. The hair was what told me first that this was a person, not a mannequin. A strip of scalp with hair, and then a bald place, and then another strip. The chest had collapsed in the way a barn collapses when the beams rot and the roof lets go. The arms were bound along the crossbar. The legs were bound to the post. The clothes weren't just the jacket. There was a shirt under it, and jeans that had become a second hide. The boots were tied on with cord. I stepped back and the field moved around me. You could feel the space under the sky grow larger or smaller depending on what your mind was doing. Mine was trying to find something to put on this that would make it make sense. Hunters find bodies. Hikers find bodies. You don't find a body in a scarecrow unless someone put it there. I went to the house and called the sheriff. It took too long for them to find me. I don't mean that in the way a city person means it, where they're angry if the pizza comes 10 minutes late. I mean that the time I spent waiting had weight and pressed me down. I stood at the window watching the field, and then I sat at the table with the phone in my hand, and then I stood again. I didn't go back out. I didn't look again. I didn't cover the thing back up. The voice that answered at the sheriff's office said all the right words, but said them slow and measured, as if I might be drunk. 2 cars came. A truck with a county seal came after. A man and a woman in uniforms walked into my kitchen with their hats in their hands, and without meaning to, I felt like I had to wipe the counters and stand straighter. The woman's nameplate said Westcott. The man said Lane. Westcott did most of the talking. She asked me where the scarecrow was and if I was sure. "Am I sure about what?" I asked. "What you saw." I nodded. I took the coat open I saw a person. I didn't touch anything else. Any idea who it might be? I thought of the neighbor's scarecrow and told myself to keep it separate. No, I said. I don't know anyone out here. Your uncle? He's buried in the cemetery by the church, I said. I went there. I visit. She wrote that down like it mattered, which made me feel like I'd said a dumb thing. Lane stood by the window looking out at the fields like people do when they want to be outside and also inside. You call us pretty quick, he said without looking at me. I did, I said. You didn't try to bring it down, he said. The scarecrow. You left it. I thought you might want to see it as I found it, I said. That seemed to satisfy him, or else make him quiet. We walked out together. The county truck had a man in it who took pictures. Another truck with the volunteer fire emblem pulled up, and a woman in a reflective vest got out and looked at my boots before she looked at me, like she was making sure I wasn't about to walk through something I shouldn't. They all moved like people who had done this before in other places. They didn't hurry. They set cones around the scarecrow like there were cars about to run it over. When they peeled the jacket open, Westcott glanced at me to see what I would do. I didn't do anything. The county man took photos. The woman in the vest took notes for herself, or for the world. Lane stood with his hands on his belt like that helped hold him up. The wind pulled at the hat on the scarecrow. It tilted and then sat back down. I wanted someone to take it off and didn't want to watch them touch it. Bound with wire, the county man said, not rope. Wire's what you have when you don't have rope, Lane said. No, the county man said. You choose wire when you want it to bite. They spoke about bone lengths, teeth, recovery, phrases that made me feel like a ghost inside my own head. They didn't say murder, not then. They didn't say accident either. They treated the thing like a problem of wood and wire and sky. Can you step back to the house? Westcott asked me gently. We'll be there in a minute. I stepped back, and then I stepped back again. I turned and walked to the porch and stood there. The boards under my feet looked the way boards look when men in boots have stood on them together. It's a particular kind of wear that makes darker shapes. The wind had picked up and the clouds were moving across the ridge faster than the trees could agree. They were there for 3 hours. I watched them take the scarecrow apart. I watched them put pieces into bags. When they came up to the porch, Westcott said, "We'll need a statement." I told her what I saw. The jacket, the wire, the hair, the way the skin had pulled tight and the eyes were gone. I heard my voice change on that last part and wished I could reach out and shape it back. Lane took notes in a cramped hand. "Your uncle built that?" he asked. "It was there when I got here," I said. "I didn't watch him build it. He's been dead since winter before last." "You never talked to him about the scarecrow." I looked at him. He didn't do it in the week before he died and hide it in the field. I think we'd have noticed. Westcott gave Lane a look that made him close his notebook. She said, "We'll let you know what we can. In the meantime, you have somewhere you can stay." "This is my house," I said. "I stay here." "You could stay in town at the motel for a night or two," she said. "Sometimes scenes like this, you know." She didn't finish. She didn't have to. Some things echo, and you don't always get to choose how long. "I'll be here," I said. They left tracks in the driveway. The cones remained in the field, odd bright shapes against the green. I went out after they drove off and looked at the empty post. The jacket was gone. The crossbar was still there, and there were stains on the wood that didn't look like weather. I told myself to stop putting words to things I didn't understand. That night I sat on the porch with the light off and listened. You'd think the sound would be louder after something like that. It wasn't. The farm went back to its set of small noises. The crickets piped. A bird that should have been asleep called once, and then was quiet. Far off, a truck on the county road threw its sound ahead of itself, and then gathered it back. I slept on the couch again, because the upstairs felt like a place where you had to be certain of yourself. At some point, I dreamt I was walking along the ridge, and the ground under my feet was a rug someone was pulling from the house. The rug rolled up and I kept trying to step on flat ground, but my feet found only curved fabric. I woke with the taste of dust in my mouth. There were tire tracks in the drive in the morning that I didn't recognize. Mud from a pattern I hadn't seen. I told myself they were the county truck, though I remembered where they had parked, and this was not that. I walked to the road. The gate was closed. The latch hung right. The fence was as I left it. I followed the tracks back to where they curved behind the barn, and ended as if someone had picked up their vehicle and gone on without it. There was an oil stain there I didn't remember from before, black and fresh. I worked that day because I had to. Work is a way to shape the air around you. I cleaned the tack room in the barn, though there were no horses, and I swept and found a small drawer under the bench that held a little book and a pencil. The pencil was half a pencil. The book was my uncle's. Not a ledger the county would care about. A personal one. The handwriting was his block letters, careful and slow. The first entry was a list of the hay bales he'd set aside for winter in a year, 4 years before he died. The second entry was a note to himself about fixing the wellhead on a Monday. There were entries like that, and then one that said, "Elder came by about the fence. Said he heard voices. I told him it was wind in the pipes a month later. Marla not at work. Al said she moved. Pike says Pike things. The next. Crows at the south field. Shut off the pump. Don't go out at night." I read that one 3 times. The date was 2 summers ago. As far as I knew, my uncle had gone out at night. He'd been found in his kitchen in winter when he didn't show up in town, and Hal went looking. Natural causes, people said, which means his body was done with him in a way that matched cleanly with the way the world likes to be told things end. The wellhead. Shut off the pump. It made me think of the note on the barn wall in pencil. There's a way your mind will keep a problem. Turn it in its hands when you're not looking. I put the book in my pocket and went to the well. The cap was bolted. The pump was the old electric under the hood. I checked the switch. It was off. The power ran to it from the house, though I had never heard it run. I walked back to the kitchen and opened every drawer until I found a socket set. I went back and took the bolts off the cap one by one. The cap lifted with a metallic sigh. The smell that came up wasn't the clean, cold smell of a deep hole full of water. It was the smell of something that had gone wrong and then been held there. Rot with a sharp, cold edge. I stepped back and swallowed, and then stepped forward again, because it felt like turning away would make it worse. I shone a flashlight down. The beam fell and then found water, dull and brown-green like a bruise. It wasn't moving. Water moves a little, even in a well, and this did not. I looked around the head for signs of animals, feathers, anything that would tell a story where a bird of some kind had fallen in and caused this. The stones around the well were clean. The cover had been tight. It didn't make sense and therefore made too much. I replaced the cap and tightened the bolts. I stood there a while and listened to the field. You can hear a difference between wind-called sound and sound that comes from something living. The wind was steady. The corn beyond the fence rubbed leaf against leaf. A crow called like a person might call if they didn't care whether they were heard. Over the ridge, church bells rang, late or early. Not for me. That evening, as the sun went down and the shadows from the trees reached toward the house, a truck stopped at the gate. I watched from the porch and kept my hands out of my pockets invisible, a thing I'd learned in the city when you didn't want to be mistaken for trouble. A man got out. He was thin the way some farmers are thin, wire and sinew, no fat. He wore a cap with a feed company logo and a shirt with pearl snaps. He looked at the latch, then looked up and saw me. "You got that call today," he said. He didn't ask. "I'm Elder." I remembered the name from the book and from the list and tried not to let that show in my face. I know who you are," he said. "Word gets around. You found something in your field." "The sheriff found it," I said. "I called." He nodded, as if that small distinction mattered. "You ought not to keep a scarecrow like that." "I didn't keep it," I said. "I didn't put it there. I didn't know." His jaw worked like he wanted to spit but was too polite to do it near my gate. "You keeping the pump running?" "It's off," I said. "Has been. Maybe before I got here." "You keep it off." "I will," I said. And then, because I am not good at quiet. "Why?" He looked past me at the house, at the field, at the ridge that was not mine, but was part of my view. "Bad water," he said. "It happens. You don't want to pull from it." "Because of the smell?" I asked. I opened the cap. He shook his head. "Because it brings things you don't want pissing around your place." "Like what?" I said, which I regretted immediately, but the question was out. He glanced toward the road, like someone might be there listening, and then back at me. "People," he said finally. "You don't want people coming around thinking you got more than you got." "I don't have anything anyone wants," I said, which sounded like a plea. "Everybody has something somebody else wants." He stepped back. "You see Pike? Tell him he owes me. He'll know what for." "I saw him at the county office," I said. "He spends too much time there." Elder got into his truck and pulled away without looking back. Night came. I ate eggs and toast and drank a beer I'd bought at a gas station, where the woman behind the counter had a baby under the counter. I stood outside until the mosquitoes became a plan, and then I went in and shut the door. I didn't turn the TV on because there was no TV. I didn't turn the radio on because there was no radio. I listened to the house. Sleep took me hard and then gave me back like a miser. I woke because there was light in the room that wasn't moonlight. A car's headlights played across the front wall, then were gone. I sat up and listened. The engine ran low, then idled, then cut. The lights had hit the porch window from an angle that made me think the vehicle had come down the road and then turned in toward my drive but didn't come up. I stood and went to the window and lifted the blind with 2 fingers. Nothing. Not nothing, but nothing I could point to. The gate was closed. The drive was empty. The road lay across the front of the farm like a piece of dark ribbon. The trees along the ridge were a blacker black against the sky. I held the blind up and waited and tried to hear an engine, and heard instead the far-off hum of the wind turbines that they'd put on the other side of the ridge 2 years back. Some nights you could hear them. This was one of those nights, though the wind wasn't strong. Before I went back to the couch, I checked the back door. The latch sat right. The vent I had fixed under the kitchen window was in place. Something scratched at the other side of it, and then stopped. I told myself it was a rat, and was surprised by the relief in the thought. Rats are honest. In the morning there was a bag on the porch just inside the gate. Paper, folded twice, tied with twine. No note. I opened it stupidly, there on the steps. Inside were 2 ears of corn with the husks still on, and under them, something wrapped in newspaper. I unrolled the paper and saw a bird, a crow, its neck broken, its feet bound together with what looked like dental floss. Its beak was taped shut. The tape was old and had taken small patches of feather with it when it was pulled out of whatever it had first stuck to. The eyes looked at nothing. The corn was fresh. I took it to the trash can by the shed and dropped the bag in and closed the lid. I stood with my hand on the lid and counted 5 breaths. Then I opened it, took the corn out, and carried it into the kitchen and washed it under the tap, because I am not the kind of person who throws away food. I dropped the bird into a contractor bag and tied it again, and walked it to the back of the property where the ground dips before the ridge rises. I left it there and told myself the coyotes would take it. I didn't look at the neighbor's field where his scarecrow stood. I ate the corn for lunch. It was bad. The kernels were starchy, not sweet. I ate both ears anyway, with salt. When I was done, I put the cob ends in the trash, and then took them out and put them into the box of compost under the sink I'd started, because I was trying to be the kind of person who does things for later. In the afternoon, Hal came by with a box of roofing nails and a roll of chicken wire and a pie his wife had made. He stood on the porch and did not step inside with his boots. "You heard," I said. He nodded. "They'll try to identify." He didn't say what. He didn't have to. "You see anything else you don't like? You come to me. Don't call Pike. Don't call Elder. Come to me." "Why would I call Elder?" I asked. "He came by and told me to keep the pump off." "He likes to be helpful when it lets him be something else later," Hal said. "You need anything today?" I looked at the nails and the wire and the pie. "I think I'm covered." "Good." He adjusted his hat. "You got someone to talk to?" "About anything?" "No," I said. "Just you." He nodded like that matched what he suspected. "We're open Sundays," he said. "We don't have to be, but people like to think they can buy screws on a Sunday if something breaks after church." "Thanks for the pie," I said. "Don't say thanks to me," he said. "Say it to my wife if you see her. But don't tell her what you saw. She's the kind of person who thinks too much at night." After he left, I repaired the screen door on the back porch, not because it needed it, but because I could. I hammered the tacks gently and pulled the mesh taut, and then stood back and looked at my work like it would lodge me in the world. The wind had shifted from the west. The smell of manure from a place I couldn't see came with it, sharp and real. There are smells that make you feel like a person because they're about living things doing what they do. There are smells that make you feel like a person because you know exactly what they mean, and you can pretend you're in charge. At dusk, I looked out to the south field and saw that someone had put the jacket back on the post. I froze in the doorway. I had taken that coat off. The county had taken it away. I had watched them bag it. But there it was, hanging open, sleeves moving slow. The hat I remembered from the first day was back on the head. I don't know how long I stood there, but the light left the ground, and the top of the post turned into a darker line. I walked out with my hands at my sides, each step like a small argument with myself. The ground had dried in patches and held my boot prints from that morning. I reached the post and reached out and put my hand on the coat. It wasn't leather. It wasn't a coat. It was an old feed sack, cut and tied like a jacket, the texture of the weave under my palm. The sleeves were stuffed with straw. The hat was not leather. It was a circle of black felt that had been soaked and dried and held together with staples. Whoever had done this knew enough to make it right from where I'd stand on the porch, but not right up close. This was a message. I didn't want to say it out loud, even in my own head, but it's what it was. Don't get above yourself. Don't think your field is clean. Don't think the things you took down stay down. I pulled the sack off and tossed it on the ground. I picked up the hat and carried it back to the house and set it on the steps like a second doormat. I went inside and wrote a note I didn't send. To whoever did that, stop. I tore it up and put it in the compost box where the corn husks were. That night, I heard the sound again at the back of the house. Not a raccoon, not the wind. A person rubbing against the siding to make a noise you would have to hear. I stood in the kitchen with the light off for a long time, holding a hammer. When I finally opened the door and stepped out, the yard was empty. My hand shook in a way that made the hammer feel like it would drop. I put it on the table and sat and put my head in my hands, because that's what you do when you're trying to keep everything from going loose. The morning after that, Westcott called to say the remains were likely a man, middle-aged, from the long bones, from the teeth. No ID yet. She asked me if I had noticed any clothes, jewelry. I said only the jacket, the jeans, the boots. She asked me not to talk to the reporter from the county paper. I said there was a reporter. She said there would be. She asked me to call if I found anything else. I hung up and looked at the note in my uncle's book again. Don't go out at night. I decided to go out in daylight to the ridge. There was a path, not a real path, more a line where the weeds didn't grow high, the way a deer trail looks when you first find it. I followed it along the fence. In places the fence had fallen and been put back up with baling wire. I ducked under and crossed onto the slope. The ground there was different. Rocks under shallow soil, lichens on the rocks like spilled paint. The trees were smaller, more stubborn. Roots hugged tight around stones. Higher up, the wind was harder. It pressed my shirt against my back and found the place where my collar didn't sit right. I found a spot where the ridge turned in a way that made a bowl, and a person could sit out of the wind and look down at the fields. There were cigarette butts there, a small circle of them, pushed into the dirt with a boot heel. There was a glass bottle half buried, label knocked off by weather. There was a piece of wire twisted into a loop and another loop. A little further on there was a square of blackened ground where someone had lit a fire at a time when you shouldn't. It was sheltered enough that the smoke would have gone straight up and then out. I sat there and looked down at my field, at the post where the scarecrow had been, at the way the light fell. The house looked small and different when I wasn't in it. The back door was a dark square. The barn's roof was a rectangle of tin like a small lake. The wellhead's cap showed a small circle in the grass. From up there, the noise carried differently. I could hear the tires of a truck on road gravel a mile away. I could hear, faintly, the turbines turning, like someone whispering on the other side of a wall. There were marks in the dirt beside me, faint, but there. Someone had dragged something heavy from the path to this bowl and then back again. Old marks, not the deep edges of something recent. The grass had grown back along the edges but left a strip where nothing wanted to. On the way down, I found a piece of leather half buried under leaves, stiff and curved. I dug it out with my fingers. It was a glove, cut along the palm, the fingers stiff. Someone had cut the index finger off at the second knuckle. I held it up and looked at the farm through it. The world framed by that torn leather looked the same. By the time I got back to the house, a note was stuck behind the hinge of the front door. It was on lined paper, torn from a notebook, folded in fours. It said, in small, careful letters, "Keep fence closed." And below that, "Some of them can't cross." I didn't call Westcott. I put the note on the table and sat in front of it and tried to slow my breathing because I felt like I'd been running. And maybe I had, somewhere in my head. I thought about what "them" meant. Coyotes, dogs, people. I thought about what "can't" meant. Won't, don't, shouldn't. The note didn't say. In the afternoon, a boy on a dirt bike rode the edge of my ditch and kicked stones into it. He looked at the house like someone had told him a story. He rode on. In the evening, a woman I didn't know drove past slow and looked at the gate and then sped up. At dark, a light flicked on in the neighbor's distant kitchen and then off. I went out with a flashlight and walked the fence line, slowly, running my hand along the wire as I went. There were places where the line lost its tension, and I set the light down and pulled and twisted and made it sing again. When I came near the spot where the scarecrow had been, I found a charm hanging from the top strand, a little bundle of sticks tied together with red thread, like a nest that hadn't decided what it wanted to be. It turned gently in the breeze. I took it down and set it in my pocket. On my way back to the house, I tossed it into the tall grass and told myself it would become part of the ground like anything else. I slept hard and woke to the sound of a car that wasn't stopping. Morning brought a wind from the north that made the leaves look like fish scales. I made coffee and went out to the porch. On the steps sat the hat from the fake scarecrow I'd set there, but it wasn't the same anymore. Someone had written on the underside in pencil, in those same careful letters, "You keep it off." The pump, the well. I stood and looked at the cap. It sat there like it always had. Beyond, the ridge, the bowl, the cigarette butts, the jacket that had been a body, and the jacket that had been a feed sack. My uncle's note. The sheriff's careful voice. Hal with the pie. Pike with his sideways walk, Elder's thin face, the crow with its beak taped shut. I put the hat back on the step and went inside and took the wrench and the screwdriver and my nerve and walked to the well. I put the wrench on the bolts and turned them half a turn each, cross pattern, like a person tightening a tire. I lifted the cap and set it aside. The smell that rose wasn't as strong as before, which didn't mean anything. I shone the light and saw water darker now, still. I went to the pump and looked at the switch. It was off. I put my finger out like a person might touch a stove to see if it's hot, and stopped and curled my hand and put it back in my pocket. There is a kind of pride that is really the same thing as fear. I didn't flip the switch. I didn't even touch it. I put the cap back, and I sat in the grass near the well and watched the ants find my boot. I sat there until the sun moved a whole hand width in the sky. By late afternoon, the wind carried the smell of smoke. Not a house burning, not timber. It was the smell of straw and lighter fluid, a quick burn, like someone had started a small fire to send a message. I looked toward the south field and saw, beyond my line, in the neighbor's corn, a thin column of smoke moving crookedly up through the leaves. I walked to the fence and climbed it, and dropped down and pushed into the corn. The rows closed over me. The ground under the stalks was damp and dark. Bugs lifted and settled and made small lives I didn't see. I reached the scarecrow. The hat was on fire. The fire ran down the sleeve and then across in a line, tasting. The body was what a scarecrow usually is, clothes stuffed with straw, tied with twine to a post. The fire made a sound like a whisper, and then like a breath taken earlier. I reached out to knock the hat off with a stick, and then stopped because the stick was a broken femur. I dropped it and stepped back. The fire climbed and then fell in on itself, as if the body had decided to help. I backed out of the corn row as the smoke thickened. At the edge of my field, I turned and watched. The fire didn't spread. It ate what it had been given, and then was done. I tasted something bitter in my mouth that wasn't smoke. When I wiped my face, my hand came away with dirt and something like ash. I called the neighbor's house number, which I didn't have, and so I called Hal, who didn't answer. And then I called the county, where a voicemail box told me that non-emergency issues would be addressed in the order they were received. I am not a person who knows how to name emergencies well. I stood there with my phone and felt the edge of an old life rub against a new one. Evening came. The field cooled. The wind turbines beyond the ridge stopped and then started slowly again. Coyotes called to each other in a way that made all the hairs on my arms stand. I went inside and locked the doors, and then set a chair under the handle like a person in a movie, because there is a part of me that thinks props make a difference. I went up to the second floor for the first time in days and opened the door to my uncle's bedroom. The bed was made, tight corners, a shirt folded on a chair, a Bible with a ribbon stuck in a place where the pages were thin. In the closet, among his coats, a bag. In the bag, on the bottom, under an old pair of boots, a small jar full of teeth. Not human. Pig. Maybe deer. The shapes were not all the same. Some had the look of tools. Some were shaped like things that tear. The jar had a label that said MISC. I sat on the bed and held the jar, and then put it back and closed the closet and sat again. It is possible to find a normal thing in a strange place, and feel more unease than if you found a strange thing in a strange place. The jar had weight. The room had the smell of someone who had once been alive. The wind moved the curtain, and the curtain brushed my hand. When I went downstairs again, there was a figure at the fence. It stood leaning, one arm over the top strand in a way of tiredness. The hat was low. The coat hung heavy. It was not the scarecrow because the scarecrow was not there, and this was at my gate. I stood inside the house where the porch light did not reach, and felt the old wood under my feet. Whoever it was didn't move. Maybe they were looking at the cones left by the county. Maybe they were looking at the house. Maybe they were just making me see them. I stood there as long as they stood there. When I blinked, the figure was gone. I went to the window and saw only fence and night, and the small shape of a charm on the top wire that I hadn't put there. I didn't sleep that night. I lay very still and listened, and the house made only the sounds it had always made. Once there was a hoot from the trees that made me feel better, though I couldn't say why. Once there was the distant crack of a shot, one and then another, and then silence that fit itself back into the dark. At dawn, a note was nailed to the post at the gate. It said, "Half," and then underneath, "Keep it that way." I stood with my hands at my sides and stared at the word. I didn't take the paper down. I didn't touch the nail. I felt something roll inside my chest like a bottle in the back of a truck. Half of what? Half the story? Half my field? Half the water in the well? Half the time I thought I owned the day? I went in and made coffee and drank it standing, and waited for the sun to clear the ridge so I could see better. When it did, the post where the scarecrow had been looked like anything else in a field. The cones shone brighter than I liked. The hat on the step looked like a thing a child would make when asked to draw a hat. I opened my uncle's book again and found a page with a smear I'd thought was dirt. It was blood, faint, rubbed into the paper. Under it he'd written, "If I'm gone, don't sell. Fence stays closed. Pump stays off. We keep what's ours." That afternoon, the sheriff came back. Westcott stood in the kitchen and looked at the notes on the table and then at my face. "You should leave for a few days," she said. "Let us work." "This is my house," I said again, hearing myself sound like a person with a small argument he repeats, because it feels like a bigger one. "We can't make you," she said, "but I'd like it if you did." "Do you think I did it?" I asked. "The scarecrow?" She blinked. "No," she said, "but I think someone wants you to think things about what you saw. And I don't know yet whether those things are true." Lane didn't say anything. He walked to the back door and stood with his hand on the frame like he was feeling for heat. "Do you know Elder and Pike?" I asked her. "I know everybody," she said, "but I don't know everybody the same way." "They left notes," I said. "Or someone did." "Don't keep those," she said. "Or do, but don't fix them to your head." "I keep the fence closed," I said, and I didn't know whether I was asking for approval. "That's a good idea," she said. When they left, I sat with the word "half" in my mind and in my hands. I went to the barn and took a crumpled tarp from the corner and cut it into strips and tied those strips to the top wire of the fence every 10 posts, so that when the wind moved I could see the line. I moved along the perimeter with wire cutters and pliers and gloves, and made small repairs that together were not small. When the sun fell, I was at the far corner, where the land meets the ditch, and then the road. The ditch water was low and brown, and smelled like everything it had touched. Across the road, a man stood. He wore a coat too heavy for the weather. His hands were in his pockets. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't nod. He watched me the way you watch something you're not sure is going to work. When I turned to look down the line, he was gone. I walked back along the fence and checked each gate. I checked the latch at the road twice. I stood with the metal cold under my fingers for a small eternity, and then I let it go and turned toward the house. My boots left prints in the dust that would hold their shape until the next wind came and put its own pattern down. The barn leaned as it always had. The house waited. I stood at the edge of the porch and listened, and somewhere a wire hummed. It might have been the fence in the wind. It might have been the pump remembering how to be on. I went inside, locked the door, and waited for night to move in. The day after the sheriff came that second time, I tried to work the way I had before. I fixed a hinge. I stacked rotten boards for a dump run. I walked the fence. The word on the post kept pulling my eye. Half. By noon I knew I wouldn't get anything done. I kept stopping and looking at the ridge. There's a way a place holds your head like a hand at the back of your neck. I took a bottle of water and my uncle's book and went up the path again, slower, checking for anything I had missed the first time. There were more cigarette butts than I remembered. I don't think someone had added them. I think I hadn't wanted to see them. There was a flattened piece of copper wire twisted like a fish. There were prints from boots with a tread I didn't own. 2 sizes. One narrow, one wide with a smooth patch in the heel. At the bowl, the fire scars looked older in daylight. Soot in the top layer of dirt. Beer caps pressed in. A square of burlap like someone had ripped a feed sack and laid it down to keep knees from getting wet. I sat with my back against rock and opened the book. There was an entry I'd marked and skimmed but hadn't taken in. After the dry spell, Elder says a share. If we pull, they'll come. Keep fence. Keep pump off but leave the handle as is. If you see them at the wire, don't talk. Don't hand nothing over. They only understand deals if someone's there to make them. Hal says don't be stupid. Pike says he'll handle it. I told him to go to hell. Below that, an older entry about a calf-born breech and a note about changing oil in the tractor. That was my uncle. The strange pressed against the ordinary. He smoothed it together and kept moving. I looked down at my field. The cones were gone. I hadn't taken them. The county must have come very early or late. I didn't like that I hadn't noticed. A man on the road slowed at the gate and then drove on. A hawk circled over the ditch and then headed for the other side of the ridge. On the way down, I almost stepped on it. A charm like the one I'd found on the fence, except this one had hair tied into it. Blonde, brittle, bound with that same red thread. There was dirt ground into the hair like it had been worn against skin. I put it in my pocket because leaving it there felt worse. Back at the house, I spread the book and the charm and the hat with the pencil writing on the table, and looked like that would make the parts line up. It didn't. I called Westcott and told her about the charm with hair. She said to bag it and she'd come by tomorrow. I told her about the bowl with the cigarettes and the fire. She said people sit everywhere. She wasn't wrong. She said, "Do you want me to send a car to do a drive-by at night?" I told her no, because I didn't want people at the fence when the light changed. That night, the pump clicked. It's an unmistakable sound when you live with an old system. Relays and contactors have their own voices. It clicked one time. Not on, not running. Just the sound of a switch pulled and then put back. I froze with the dish in my hand and listened so hard my jaw hurt. It didn't click again. But the sound reached back through all my nerves and found every time the wind in the wires had sounded like a hum and made those times line up. I dried the dish and put it down and went to the back door and stood there and did nothing, because I didn't want to be the person who went out into the yard, because something clicked. After a while, I told myself to move. I stepped out. The yard smelled like cut grass, even though I hadn't mowed. The light from the kitchen came to the edge of the porch, and then died. The fence shivered a little in the breeze, and the strips of tarp turned, and then stopped. I took the flashlight and walked to the well. The cap sat tight. The bolts shone a little with the fine coat of oil I had wiped on them so they wouldn't seize. I put my fingers on the metal. It was cold. The pump under the little hood was still. I put the light on the switch without touching it. It was where it had been. I killed the beam and stood in the dark and listened until the night made itself one piece again. I slept but poorly, and woke to a noise I couldn't name. Not knocking, not a voice. It was the sound of something moving through brush with patience. It came from the north side where the field meets the ridge. I turned on my side and watched the ceiling go from dark to gray to pale. In the morning there were shoe prints at the fence, not boots. Shoes with thin tread, men's or women's hard to say, the kind you wear in town. They came out of the ditch, crossed the road, stepped over the lowest wire. I could see where the grass was pressed, and then stopped at the fence itself, toes almost touching, as if whoever it was had stood right there and looked in for a long time. Then the prints turned and went back the way they had come. They didn't step onto my side. "Some of them can't cross," the note had said. I didn't like that. I felt a small relief. It was a clear day. The sun took the wet places and made them steam. I took the truck into town and bought a lock for the back gate that was heavier than it needed to be. Hal rang me up and didn't make conversation beyond asking if I wanted a cold soda from the machine. I asked him, "What does half mean?" He looked at me for a long time without pretending he didn't know what I meant. "Used to be there were understandings," he said finally. "Not written. One side of the road kept to one thing, the other side kept to another. That's as plain as I can say it without stepping on people I see every day." "Which side am I on?" He didn't smile. "You're on your uncle's land. That's the side you're on. If a man wants to tell you you're on the other side, he can come say it to your face." "Elder came to the gate," I said. "He told me to keep the pump off." "Good advice," Hal said. "You think he was giving it to be helpful?" "Advice can be helpful and still be about the person giving it," he said. "You want me to come by later?" I wanted to say yes. I said no because I couldn't explain what I wanted him to see. He put a handful of screws in my bag and didn't ring them up. "Don't be out late," he said. "I know you'll do what you want, but don't." On the road back, a small car followed me too close and then passed on the double line. A girl with a baseball cap pulled low glared at me like I had done something to her future. The ridge held a shadow even in full sun. A crow lifted off my mailbox when I pulled in and dropped something dark into the grass. It was the charm I'd thrown. Someone had tied it to a rock with red thread so it would stay. I left it where it lay and went inside. Toward evening I saw them. Not ghosts, people. 2 men and a woman, standing at the far line of the north fence where the land meets the first rise. They were still, as if they had grown there. They faced inward, toward my field. They were far enough away that I couldn't make out faces, only hats or hair, and the way shoulders hang on a body. They didn't call. They didn't move. I looked away to pick up the binoculars from the shelf by the door, and when I looked back, they were gone. I was not brave that night. I sat at the table and ate without tasting, and then I went upstairs and took the jar of teeth back out and carried it down and set it on the porch railing like a weird lantern. I don't know what I thought that would do. I told myself 100 ways I could leave. I could lock the door and drive to a motel in town and sleep with the TV on. I could call a friend from the city who would say, "Come stay with me," and then mean it. I could sell in the fall to the neighbor who always wanted to square his fields and go back to a place where fences are metaphors. I didn't do any of that. I sat with my back to the sink and watched the door. Near midnight, the pump clicked again. This time, the click came with a sound that wasn't the pump at all. It was the sound of water moving where water doesn't move. I went out before I could think better. The yard was light enough from the moon that I didn't need the flashlight. The fence strips were still. The well cap sat in its place. Beside it, a wet mark had formed, dark on the dirt, as if something had been lifted out and set down. The pump switch was still off. I turned my head and saw the figures by the fence. 3 on the north line, none on the road. Standing. Close enough now that I could see faces if I got closer. I did not get closer. The middle one held something against the wire like a gift. It was a jar, a canning jar with a metal lid. The moon put a small glare on the glass. Inside, something floated. I could tell myself it was peaches and syrup. It wasn't. It was a small animal, mouse or bird, wedged into the space under liquid that moved as the person breathed. They hung the jar on the wire by its lid and stepped back. They didn't look at me. They looked at the house, then at the well, then back at the house. I didn't say anything. They didn't say anything. We stood in our places until either they had what they came for, or I agreed to something by standing there. They turned and walked along the fence and disappeared at the corner where the ditch deepened. When I reached the jar, the smell told me first. It wasn't peaches. It was the sharp, cold smell from the well, changed, like it had been strained through meat. I took the jar down and set it on the ground and stepped on it until the glass gave and the liquid ran into the dirt. I took the lid and threw it as far as I could toward the ridge. I went inside and locked the door and poured bleach into the sink, even though it didn't touch the jar outside. That's how fear works sometimes. You clean the wrong place to feel like you've done something. Morning made the broken glass glitter. I picked up the larger pieces and left the rest for the mower I didn't own yet. Westcott came that afternoon. She took the charm with hair and the notes and made copies of my uncle's pages where the pump and the fence were mentioned. "You can go stay in town," she said again. They were at the fence, I said. They hung a jar on it. Who is they? I don't know, I said. People. Did you recognize anyone? If I had, I don't know that I would tell you. I surprised myself with that. It wasn't defiance. It was the feeling that this wasn't the same as a bar fight or a theft. It was older and dumber and more likely to get somebody I couldn't see hurt. She put her notebook away. You can come stay in town, she said softer. I'll be here, I said. If I leave, somebody will open my gate, and then I'll have to come back to a place that got used while I was gone. She didn't argue. On the way out, she ran her hand over the frame of the back door, as if checking for heat the way Lane had. Call me, she said, even if what you want to say sounds like something you'd be embarrassed to say out loud. The days went on like they were trying to be ordinary. In the morning I worked. In the afternoon I watched the ridge. At dusk I walked the fence. After dark I sat with a hammer or a bottle or a book and tried not to jump at my own chair when I moved my leg. The notes stopped. The jars stopped. The footprints at the fence didn't. They came and went like tide marks. The county paper printed a small story. Remains found on farm, it said. No foul play suspected at this time, which didn't match the wire in the jacket and the way the body had been hung in a field to pretend it was only pretend. The reporter called and I didn't answer. A man at the gas station asked if I was the one with the scarecrow. I said yes, and he said he liked my truck. I saw Elder at the store. He didn't meet my eyes. He bought salt and a bag of scratch grain and a stack of cheap pans. I saw Pike on the road. He lifted 2 fingers off his wheel. He had the look of a man who sleeps at odd hours because he doesn't want to share the dark with other people. The neighbor on the north side, whoever he was, harvested early. One day the corn was there, and the next it wasn't. The field looked shaved. The scarecrow that had burned was gone, post and all. In its place there was a stump that looked cut, even though it must have been pulled. At night, the open land changed the way sound moved. You could hear more and less. The turbines on the far side of the ridge turned lazy. Sometimes they were still. And those nights were worse. Then one morning there were cattle in my field. Not mine. A small group, 5, standing near the south fence, heads down, thick tongues pulling grass. A calf lifted its head and stared at me like I had said something rude. They weren't from across the road. That man didn't keep cows. They must have pushed through weak wire somewhere along the west line, or someone had cut the fence and let them in to make a point. I grabbed a bucket and shook it, and called the way I'd seen on videos and felt foolish. The cows looked at me and went back to eating. I walked the fence until I found the cut. 2 strands, clean, like someone had used good cutters and didn't hurry. The prints in the dirt were the same thin-soled shoes I'd seen at the north line. They had stepped over the lower wire, cut the 2 above, pulled them back and tied them to a post, and then gestured to cows the way you might move children. I called Hal. He came with a length of wire and a coffee. We repaired the fence with our shoulders together and said very little. When we were done, the cows were still in my field. You can push them, he said. Wave your arms and make a wall. If they don't go, don't let them pin you. We waved and clapped and said things that weren't words, and the cows moved along the fence line until they found the cut, and saw it wasn't a cut anymore, and then they moved along again. It took us the better part of an hour to get them to an opening near the south corner, and then through. When they were out, Hal stepped through and closed the last strand with a twist and a clean knot. While he worked, I watched the ridge. A person sat in the bowl, just a shape against the rocks, watching us the way you watch a job you had a hand in and didn't want to own. I didn't point it out to Hal. He knew. When he finished, he didn't look up there. He said, "You see them?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Don't give them anything." And I said, "I won't." That night there were no clicks. The next night there were 2. The night after that there was the sound of something dropped on the porch. I waited a long time before I opened the door. On the step sat a small metal box, like a lunch pail with a clasp. It was painted green once, and then painted blue, and both paints had worn off in places where hands grip. I took it inside and set it on the table, and looked at it until that felt like agreeing to something, and then I opened it. Inside were photographs, paper photos, glossy, the size you get from drugstore machines, some bent at the corners. They were of fields and fences and scarecrows. Some looked like my field. Some were definitely not. In 3, a man was hanging wire with a pair of pliers. His face was turned so you could only see his jaw and ear. In 4, a woman stood beside a well cap with her hands in her pockets. She looked like she had been asked a question she didn't plan to answer. In 2, a scarecrow had fallen and lay face down. In 1, the scarecrow's face was clear, and it wasn't straw. At the bottom of the stack, me, at the fence, tying a strip of tarp to the wire, taken from a distance from the ridge, a thin figure in a thin field. On the back, in those careful letters, half. I put the photos back in the box and closed it and set it on the porch railing next to the jar of teeth. I wanted to throw them in the fire pit and watch them curl. I didn't. I left them there like they were part of the furniture and went inside and lay on the couch with my arm over my eyes and listened to the blood in my head. Near dawn, someone knocked. Not on the door, on the gatepost. A hollow sound that carried. I went out and stood on the porch and waited for whoever it was to say what they had come to say. A man stood at the gate. Not Elder. Not Pike. He was young. The kind of young that happens when you do hard work and don't have anything left over. He wore a denim jacket and a hat with no logo, and shoes that didn't belong on a farm. He held nothing in his hands. He said, "You have what we have." "I don't know what you think I have," I said, which was true in too many ways. He nodded like he knew I would say that. "You keep it. We'll keep ours." "I don't want anything of yours," I said. "We don't want anything of yours," he said. "But the fence is old." "It's not always a fence." "Then fix your side," I said. He smiled at that, not with his mouth but with something tired in his eyes. "We used to share," he said. "Your uncle remembered." He didn't like it, but he remembered. Half is better than none. He looked toward the well and back at me. "Turn that on, and you'll have more than half. It won't stay quiet. Don't turn it on." "I won't," I said. He nodded and touched 2 fingers to the brim of the hat like a man in a photograph and walked along the road. He didn't look back. He disappeared past the ditch bend, and then he was on the ridge, a shape on the path. And then he was gone. He had moved faster than he should have been able to. I didn't tell Westcott. I told myself I was saving her time. The truth was, I didn't want to explain what not always offense sounded like to me. The next day, the county called. They had an ID on the man in my field. It was in her voice before she said it. The careful tone people use when they want you to know they are holding something sharp. She said the name and I wrote it down and looked at it and didn't recognize it. She said he had a record, petty theft, trespass, something involving copper wire in a scrapyard. She said he had been missing 2 years. She asked if I'd ever met him. I told her I didn't think so. She asked me not to say his name in town yet, which is a funny thing to ask in a place where nothing stays still. After we hung up, I called Hal. He didn't answer. I called again and he picked up and said his hands were full of grease. I told him the name and he was quiet. Then he said, he was from across, and I didn't need him to say more. That afternoon, Pike came by without turning in. He rolled down his window and sat with his elbow out like he was in a parade that had given up. "You get your answer yet?" he asked. "What's the question?" I said. "Whose is whose? What's yours and what's theirs?" "I have a fence," I said. "You have a line of wire," he said. "A fence is an agreement, not metal." He looked older in the light. The limp made his whole body tilt, like a boat that's taken on water. "You watch your pump," he said. "A thing doesn't have to be on to be used." "What does that mean?" He laughed one bark. "You'll know it when you see it. Or you won't. Your uncle didn't. He kept a jar he shouldn't have kept." He nodded at the porch where the green box sat. "You ought to burn that." "Why?" I asked. "So it's gone?" "So it's not used," he said. "There's a difference. I didn't burn the box. I should have. I brought it inside because leaving it out felt like leaving a child in the yard during a storm. That night I didn't sleep at all. I sat at the table with the box open and the photos spread and my uncle's book and the charm and the hat and the jar of teeth. I looked at them in different orders. Nothing added up, except this. There had been an arrangement I hadn't been told about, and I had broken it just by existing in a house that still smelled like my uncle. Sometime after midnight, the house got cold. Not like weather, the kind of cold that comes when something opens. The pump clicked. The well cap gave a small sound, like a jar lid whooshing when you break the seal. I went out without the light and stood at the edge of the porch and saw the shape at the well. A person, bent, hands on the cap, hair down over their face. They didn't look up. They didn't move like someone trying to pry something. They moved like someone holding a thing up and offering it. "Don't," I said, and the word felt like a thing that could be touched. The person straightened when I spoke, and I saw it was a woman, not young, not old. She wore a dress that had chosen a long time ago to be gray. She looked at me like I had opened a door on her sleep. "Half," she said. Her voice was quiet, not a threat, more like a habit. "Turn it. We all get along." "It's off," I said. "It stays off." "You'll bring them," she said. "You'll bring them, and they'll bring you. That's how it works." "I don't want anything," I said. "I want you not to be here." She smiled in a way that wasn't mean and wasn't kind. "That's the only thing you can't get by asking," she said. us not being here. She put her palm flat on the cap, just for a second, and then she walked to the fence and stood there like the fence wasn't there. She didn't test it. She didn't touch it. She stood, and then she was on the other side, and I didn't see her cross. She went toward the ridge, and then she was gone. The next morning, the well cap had moved a little in its seat. The bolts were still tight. The pump was still off. There were smears on the metal like a hand had been there, and when I touched them, my fingers came away with a smell like old coins. I drove into town and bought a new cap, a heavier one with a better gasket. I bought a lock for the pump hood, and another for the box on the post, and then a third, because once you start buying locks, it's hard to stop. Hal rang me up without comment. When I loaded the caps into the truck, he came out and shut the tailgate and put his hand on the metal like he was blessing it. "Old Man Bell," he said, "had a well people liked. He didn't. He put sugar in it. Said it would make them sick if they took what wasn't theirs. It made his wife sick. It made him sick. People took anyway. Don't put anything in your well. Don't take anything out." "I won't," I said. He looked at me like he wanted to say something else. He didn't. He went back inside, and I drove home and installed the new cap and the locks, and then sat beside the pump with a beer like a man who had won a small war against something he couldn't see. That night the wind turned and came from the far side. It brought a smell like damp books. The strips on the fence lifted and lay down. They sounded like someone letting out a breath. I sat on the porch with the green box and the jar on the railing and watched the road. No one came. At some hour that didn't matter. I fell asleep in the chair and dreamt of the hat on the step filling with water. I woke to voices. Out by the fence, not loud, not hiding. Men talking the way men do when they have a job and want to finish it. I stood and my knees hurt, and I went to the edge of the porch and looked. 4 men at the north line. 1 on my side. The one on my side was Pike. He stood with his hands on his hips, and his head tilted because the world didn't tilt the way his leg did, and he had to fix the difference by posing. On the other side, Elder, the young man with the denim jacket, and another I didn't know. They had wire and a length of fence post, and something wrapped in a tarp. Pike looked at me and then looked away. He said, "We got to reset it." "Reset what?" I asked. "The line," he said. Elder said, "Half." Like a man in church saying a word everyone knows. The young man didn't look at me. He kept his hand on the tarp bundle like it was a dog that might run. "What's in the tarp?" I asked. "Nothing," Elder said, which meant it was something. "You aren't coming in," I said. "If you need to tie wire on your side, tie wire on your side. You aren't coming in." Pike shrugged. "Then stand back." I didn't stand back. I walked to the fence and stood with my fingers on the top wire. They didn't touch it. That seemed important. They set the new post on their side, at an angle, not in line with mine. They tied the wire on their side to it with loops that looked pretty, the way some knots look pretty. The tarp moved a little, and the young man put his hand on it harder. "Don't do this," I said to Pike, because he was the only one who would hear me in the way I meant it. "Don't be part of this." He looked down at my hand on the wire. "It was easier when your uncle was here," he said. He knew not to watch. Elder said, We don't want trouble, which is the thing people say when they are putting trouble under a tarp. What's in it? I asked again. Nothing, Elder said again, and the young man said, he's got to look. Otherwise, he'll make it wrong. They pulled the tarp. Under it was a jacket and wire in a shape you know even when you tell yourself not to. Not old, not weathered, new. They had made arms out of conduit and tied gloves on. They had made a head from burlap and soaked it and tied it with string in the places where a face would go. They had found boots. The jacket was leather. The jeans were the same brand my uncle wore. No, I said, and the word came out flat. We don't put it on your side, the young man said. We put it on ours. We put it at the line. The birds see and they keep away. That's not what this is, I said. He didn't disagree. Pike's face looked like it wanted to be two different things. He said, it keeps them from coming in. Who? Everyone, he said, and somehow that didn't sound like an exaggeration. I wanted to shout. I wanted to run at the fence and shake it until it sang and then broke. I didn't. I stood and watched them tie the jacket to the crossbar and the burlap head to the top. I watched them put wire through sleeves. I watched them stand the post on their side, in ground that wasn't mine, and tamp it with their heels. The scarecrow faced my house. When they were done, they stepped back, hands on hips, the way men do at the end of a job when they are choosing how to feel about themselves. Elder tipped his chin at me in a way that wasn't a nod, and wasn't not. Turn the pump, the young man said, and we will know. We know how to hear it. He put his hand out flat toward the well, like a man warming himself at a stove, and then dropped it, and the four of them walked along the fence until the ditch hid them. I stood there until my legs felt hollow. I went to the well and put my hand on the cap. Cold. Solid. I stood with my hand there so long my palm hurt from the cold. Then I went to the porch and sat and looked at the green box and the jar and the hat, and thought about what would be left when I was gone. At dusk, the scarecrow on the north line had a hat I hadn't seen before. Wide brim, stiff, like the one that had appeared on mine that first week. I didn't go across to pull it. I had no right to. A crow sat on the hat and picked at the brim and then flew up and then down and then away to the ridge. The night came slow. My hands shook when I made dinner. I didn't eat much. The wind found the place in the window where the sash doesn't fit and made a high sound like a whistle far down a hallway. The pump did not click. The well cap did not move. I slept at the table again. The sound that woke me wasn't the pump. It was the fence. When wire sings in wind, it has a note. This was different. It was a low hum like an engine across a field. It was more than one place at once. I stepped out and the air smelled like wet copper. The strips on the wire were still as if glued. I looked north. Figures at the fence. Many. Not 3. Not 4. A dozen or more, standing close, not talking. I couldn't see faces. They didn't move. They didn't hang jars. They held nothing. They were there to be there. Behind me, from the side yard, another shape. Inside my fence this time. At the corner by the shed. Not moving. Standing. Watching. Get out, I said, and the word went nowhere. The figures at the north line didn't turn. The one by the shed didn't move. I went inside and came back with the shotgun my uncle had kept under the bed. It wasn't loaded. I hadn't found shells. I held it anyway. It made my hands less empty. They stood until the first light began. Then the hum went down like someone sliding a hand off a string. The figures didn't walk away. They weren't there. One moment there, the next not. The one by the shed left a mark in the grass like a burn that went nowhere. At full day, I walked the fence. Every 100 feet or so, a charm hung, red thread, small bits of hair. Some had bones like rats. Some had teeth that were too big to be rats. I took one down and my hand felt wrong and I put it back up. On the north line by the new scarecrow, the ground was pressed. Shoe prints, boot prints, bare feet. And under the burlap where the head would be, something had soaked through and dried. Dark. I went into the house and took the hammer and a can of paint. I went to the gate and painted over the word on the note that had stayed there. The paint covered it in a thick stroke. It didn't feel like anything. That afternoon, the young man with the denim jacket came to the gate again. He didn't wait for me to invite him in. He said, "We've done our part." "I didn't ask you to," I said. He looked at the well. He looked at the fence. He looked at my hands. "You don't have to ask. You live here." He spat into the ditch and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "A long time ago," he said. "Before your uncle, before the turbines, there was water that tasted better on this side. People came. They didn't ask. They just did. Someone put a scarecrow up that wasn't a scarecrow, and people stopped coming for a while. Then they forgot. So it was half peace, half not. That's how it is now. You want me to be part of that," I said. "You are part of that," he said. "You have a fence. That means you take a side, even if you don't think you are." He slid his hands into his pockets. "You don't have to like it. You just have to know it." "What happens if I move?" I asked. "Sell it. Leave." He didn't laugh. "Someone else will be here. It won't be simpler. It will just be someone else." He walked away. He didn't look back. He never looked back. The days turned and turned. I kept the pump off. I kept the fence closed. I walked the line and retied the strips and listened for the hum. The sheriff drove by sometimes and didn't stop. Hal came by once with a bag of nails and left it on the step with a note from his wife about plums. Pike waved from his truck and had a new limp that didn't match the old one. Elder stood at my gate one morning and looked at the well for a long time and then left without saying anything. I took the green box and the jar and the hat and put them in the barn under a tarp. I told myself I was keeping them out of sight. I told myself I was making the porch look less like a museum. I left my uncle's book on the table. One evening I went up to the bowl and sat where the cigarette butts were and watched the field. The scarecrow on the north line faced me now, not the house. Someone had turned it. The burlap hung slack. A crow sat on its shoulder and shook its feathers and flew off, annoyed. The turbine blades were still. You could hear cows half a mile away crunching what was left of the pasture. The church bells on the other side rang. I sat until the light left the tops of the fence posts and found myself thinking that this is just what it is, and that just is a word that does small crimes. The last straw came on a day with nothing in it. No visitors, no clicks, no hum. The mail was a flyer and a bill. I fixed a hinge. I swept the porch. I ate a sandwich. Around sunset, I walked to the well to check the lock, because you check things more when they matter less. The lock was off. The cap was shifted again. Not much. Enough that the gasket showed. I went cold. I looked around. No one. The fence quiet. The ditch shallow. The ridge still. I put the lock back on and tightened the cap, and then I went to the kitchen and got the roll of duct tape and wrapped it around the cap and the post, like a man keeping a thing from falling apart, because he doesn't have the right part. After dark, something moved in the crawl space under the house. Not an animal this time. Too slow. Too intentional. The screen I had repaired was pried out and then put back in so cleanly you'd miss it. I lay on the floor with my ear against the boards and listened to the sound of a hand. There's no other way to say it. Moving along the joists. Not looking for anything. Just moving to make me know it was there. When I banged on the floor with a frying pan, the sound stopped. When I stopped banging, it started again. After an hour, it stopped for good. I didn't sleep. In the morning, a note on the table. Not on the porch. On the table. "Turn it," it said. And below, "Or we do." I didn't call anyone. I didn't leave the house. I sat and looked at the note, and then I got up and went to the barn and pulled the tarp off the green box and took it to the porch and set it on the railing again. I took the jar of teeth and set it beside it, and took the hat and nailed it to the post by the gate with 2 nails, so it wouldn't blow. Then I got the shotgun and sat in the chair and waited. They didn't come in the day. They came when the light went low. 3 at first, then 5, then more. Quiet, walking the road. Shoes soft, boots quieter. They stood at the fence and didn't touch it. They looked like they were there to see a parade that had been canceled. One stepped forward and put a hand on the top wire and took it off quick, like it had stung. He was the young man. Denim jacket. Hat. He smiled at me in a way that wasn't personal. "We asked," he said. "I heard," I said. He nodded. "We'll do it and leave you your half." "No," I said. "Then you do it," he said. "Then it's not ours." The fence hummed with his hand not on it. Not a sound I liked. He looked at the shotgun and didn't give it a glance big enough to count. I stood. My legs were stiff. I went down off the porch and walked to the well. They didn't follow. They watched. I put my hand on the cap. I thought about my uncle, about the neat letters in his book, about keep fence closed, about pump stays off. I thought about the man in the jacket that wasn't a jacket. I thought about the jar with the smell of coins and meat. I thought about the note on the table that meant someone had been inside while I slept with a hammer 2 feet away. I took my hand off the cap. I turned and looked at the young man. "No," I said again. "It stays off." He looked down. He didn't look angry. He looked like someone who had been given the answer he expected. "Okay," he said, and he could have meant 100 things. He turned and walked along the fence, and the others went with him. They didn't run. They didn't talk. They passed the North Line scarecrow, and one of them patted it on the sleeve like a man pats a dog. They went toward the ditch, and then there weren't as many of them, and then there were none. I went inside and sat and waited for whatever the "or we do" was going to be. I poured coffee at some point and drank it, and didn't have to add sugar because it already tasted like fear. Hours later, or minutes, or not, there was a scream. Not at the fence, not on the road, from the ridge. A sound of a person, and not of a person. It went through the boards and into my hands. I stood and knocked my knee on the table and didn't feel it. I walked out to the yard and looked up. The bowl had fire. Not big. Enough to make a light of its own. Figures around it. Then a shape came down the path toward the fence fast, stumbling, alone. He saw me and headed for the gate, and I recognized him. The young man. He was bleeding from the head. He had something under his jacket, held tight against his stomach. "Help," he said, and the word was small. "Stop," I said. "Don't come in." He stopped, not because he wanted to, but because the fence was there. His eyes were wide with something that wasn't fear yet, and would be later. The figures on the ridge moved but didn't come down. He said, "Please," and his voice had changed. He was a child and a man at once. "What happened?" I said. He shook his head. He looked down at his arms like they weren't his. He held the thing under his jacket tighter. He said, "It opened," and I didn't ask what. "Go," I said. "Go to your side. I'll call I don't know who I meant. The sheriff, a doctor, a person who used to be his mother." He pressed his forehead to the top wire. He didn't get cut. He sobbed once, the kind of sound that comes when the body opens. Then he turned and walked along the fence. He didn't run. He didn't look back. When he reached the corner, he turned and went toward the ditch, and I lost him in the shadow. The fire on the ridge burned a little and died. The scream didn't come again. The night turned into the part of night where you are too tired to be afraid. I went inside and sat and held the phone and didn't call anyone. Morning brought flies. At the fence by the north line scarecrow, a bundle lay under its elbow like a dog sleeping. Not on my side, on theirs. It was wrapped in burlap and tied with red thread. The flies were lazy and heavy. The smell was the well smell and meat together. I didn't cross. I didn't look close. I called Westcott and told her there was something by the fence. She said she would send someone. She told me to stay inside. I said okay and stayed outside. The county truck came. Not Lane. Another deputy. He stood on my side and looked without stepping over. He took photos. He called someone on the radio and said words that weren't the words I had in my head. When they took the bundle away, the young man was not in it. He had gone somewhere else. I didn't ask. That evening Hal came and sat in the chair and ate the last of the pie his wife had made that had somehow survived all this and said very little. He looked older by years he shouldn't have had to carry. When he stood to leave, he said, "You can come sit in our store during the day. You don't have to buy anything." "I like the farm," I said. "You can like a thing and it can still be a bad place to sit," he said. I slept upstairs that night for the first time since I'd found the body in the scarecrow. The bed was my uncle's. I lay on top of the covers because there's a way you can lie inside and still feel like you have no right. I slept and woke and slept and woke. And once I dreamed I was walking the fence with my father even though he has been dead a long time. And he said, "It's not the posts. It's the idea." And I woke up and laughed, because of course that's what he'd say. When the sun was up, I made coffee and stood under the shoulder of the porch roof. A bird hit the window and fell and shook itself and flew away. The well cap was where I had left it. The locks were on. The fence was quiet. The scarecrow on the north line had lost its hat in the night. It sat in the ditch like a bowl that wanted rain. I felt the change before I noticed it. The way you feel a storm before you see it. A kind of ear-deep pressure. The water in the well moved. I swear I felt it move under the ground like a subway train in a city when you're standing on the sidewalk. I stepped to the cap and put my hand on it and felt nothing. But the feeling stayed. I went around the house and checked the crawl space. The screen was in. The nails held. I walked the fence and retied 2 strips. I went to the north line and stood in front of the scarecrow and looked at its burlap face. I took the hat from the ditch and threw it far onto their side because anger sometimes needs something you can throw. The hat rolled and stopped and looked back at me like it had eyes. Behind me, on my side, at the edge of the yard by the shed, a figure stood. Not the young man, not Elder, not Pike, not Westcott, not Hal, not anyone from town. It was my uncle, not alive, not a ghost in a sheet. Him as I remembered him, cap low, shoulders set, hands empty, face that didn't say anything until it did. "You wrote the notes," I said, and the air made the words smaller than I thought they would be. He didn't speak. He shook his head once, no, and then pointed at the well, and then at the fence, and then at the house, and then put his hand flat on his chest, like a man saying his name silently. Then he dropped the hand and the shape was only the outline of a tree moving in wind. I don't tell that to most people. If you're reading this, I am telling you because it's part of how it went, and I don't get anything by making a lie out of it. If you don't believe it, I don't blame you. I don't believe it in the daylight either. The days after were ordinary in the way a place gets ordinary by exhausting you. The sheriff called to say they had questions for people on the other side of the ridge. She didn't say who. She didn't ask me anything else. The neighbor to the south put up a new gate and painted his name on it. Big. Elder didn't come again. Pike drove by slower each time until he didn't drive by at all. The young man never came back. I kept the well off. I kept the fence closed. I stopped walking the ridge. I mowed the yard. I tore down a rotted shed and stacked the wood. I bought a cheap radio and listened to the farm report, like I could understand what it meant. I learned the sound of the turbines when there was no wind. I learned the sound of the fence when the wire had a little rust inside and sang a little lower. I learned the difference between a raccoon in the crawl space and the thing that had been there before. One afternoon I stood in the south field and looked at the post where the first scarecrow had been. I dug it out and filled the hole and planted a sapling I bought from a nursery, because I wanted something to be growing that wasn't a warning. It's a stupid idea, but I did it anyway. I watered it with a hose from the kitchen, not from the well. At the end of that month, a letter came from the county. Permit request, it said in the big letters at the top. Somebody wanted to put a line across my ditch for a road change. I drove in and sat in a room while a man explained how progress needs room. I said the ditch is where the water goes when it rains, and if they make it smaller, the water will find another way. He said they'd make it deeper. I signed where he told me and left, feeling like I had agreed to something I would only understand later. On the way home, I stopped by the cemetery. My uncle's stone is small, flat. The grass had grown over the edge. I pushed it back with my boot. I stood there and said nothing. A crow sat on the fence and watched me with one eye and then the other, and then pretended not to watch me. I told my uncle I was keeping the pump off. I told him the fence was closed. I told him I would sell if I had to, and that I didn't know yet if I had to. I told him I was sorry, even though I didn't know what I was sorry for, except all of it. When I got back to the farm, there was a package on the porch that didn't have a return address. Inside, a new hat. Leather, the brim stiff. On the underside, in pencil, "We're square." I set it on the step. It rained that night and the hat held water like a bowl. In the morning I poured it into the compost. I hung the hat on a nail in the shed and didn't look at it again. There's a state you get to where the fear becomes the way you organize your chores. I lived there for a while. Then something shifts and you realize it's not fear anymore. It's maintenance. The fence is part of it. The well is part of it. The ridge is part of it. The people beyond are part of it. The people this side are part of it. I didn't make any of it. I am just the person who happened to be standing here when it needed a person. I don't have an end to this. There wasn't a last night where someone came with fire and I fought them and won. There wasn't a morning where a contractor came and put up a new fence with concrete footings and a camera that sends pictures to my phone. And from then on, I slept with my mouth open. There wasn't a meeting in a town hall where people agreed on a rule and stuck to it. There was a season that turned and then another. The scarecrow on the North Line lost its jacket, and then someone put a new one on. The charms faded and were replaced. The pump stayed off. The well cap stayed locked. I learned to hear the difference between the click of the pump and the sound of my own blood pretending to be a machine. Sometimes, late, there is a figure at the fence. I don't always look. When I do, it is a person who wants something and who will not say it out loud because then I could say no. They stand until the light changes and then they go. Once it was a woman with a child on her hip. Once it was a man with a dog. Once it was no one and I realized I had been watching the dark and giving it a face because the mind hates empty space. After the snows, the young sapling bent and almost broke. I braced it with a stake and found myself talking to it out loud. In spring it made leaves where there had been none. That felt like a small defiance and I took what I could get. A month ago, I got a call from Westcott. They had tied the man from my field to a ring of others they were looking at. Not solved, she said, but connected. She asked me if I felt safe. I said no and yes, and it must have sounded like I was joking because she laughed and then said she didn't mean to. She told me there was a man across the ridge who had stories about me. None of them true, all of them interesting. I told her to write them down and sell them to the paper. She said, "You like it out there?" And I said, "Some days." And we let that be an answer. Today I walked the fence and replaced a broken insulator where the top wire meets a corner post. The wind was out of the south. The turbines were slow. The ditch held a little water from a storm 2 nights back. On the North Line, the scarecrow had a new hat. It had writing on the underside I couldn't read. It faced away from the house. Across the road, someone had left a plastic bag tied to the gate with nothing in it. I went back to the house and took my uncle's book and wrote on the last blank page, "Pump off." Fence closed. Keep what's ours. I added, don't go out at night. And then I crossed it out because I have gone out at night and I am still here. If you think this is a story about bad water or neighbors, you're not wrong. If you think it's about something else, I won't argue. For me, it's about the line you keep and the line you stand on by accident, and how the people on both sides decide what to make of you. The corpse in the scarecrow was a message. The second scarecrow was a second message. The hat on the step was a third. I have learned to read them. I have not learned to like them. Sometimes when the wind goes quiet and the house breathes and the fence doesn't sing, I hear the pump click in my head. I go out and put my hand on the cap. It's cold. It's always cold. I think about the word half, and whether that means fairness or truce or warning. I think about my uncle pointing. Well, fence, house, chest. I think about the young man pressing his forehead to the wire because it was the closest thing to a door he could find. I keep it off. I keep it closed. I sleep when I can.